Hello, friends and enemies, heroes and villains. Welcome to Epic Realms. Tonight's guest is an RPG designer and author. He's worked on games such as Critical Role's Tal'Dorei campaign setting, Mutants and Masterminds, DC Comics RPG, Pathfinder. The list is a mile long, everybody. Please welcome Steve Kenson to Epic Realms. Steve, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I know a lot of our audience members are big fans of a lot of the content and things that you've worked on, so it's really great to have you on here. I asked Owen Casey Stevens a while ago. I was like, "Hey, who are some people that worked over at on Mutants and Masterminds and stuff? Because I really want to get them." He's like, "Well, you definitely should get Steve." And I was like, "Well, yeah, that of course, Steve, but is there anyone else too?" So yeah, it's great having you on here, and you come greatly recommended from all kinds of other past guests. So thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
No, I'm happy to.
Your works have touched a lot of different genres, whether it's role playing, obviously, novels,
Mhm.
you know,
Mhm.
the cyberpunk Shadowrun era, comic books. Was there some major influences growing up for you in these subjects? Were you a comic book reader or role player growing up before you got into the business?
Yes and yes. Um, I was a very I don't want to overstate it. It's not super sad, but I was a sort of isolated kid. My family moved around a lot when I was young. My dad worked for the VA,
Okay.
and I used to think when I was in grade school that what kids did in the summers between grades was that you packed up your house and you moved to another state. Um, and we did that a lot. And so one summer, this was when I was about 10, we spent pretty much all of the summer living in a motel outside of Las Vegas while my parents were house hunting in the area because my dad had a new job there. And it was me and my parents and my little brother and our dog in a little, Las Vegas motel room
Wow.
um, for weeks. And so I think largely out of desperation, my parents would give me, a couple of bucks and send me to the 7-Eleven, two doors down, and I would buy comic books,
Oh, okay.
so that I would have something to do other than watch TV, or fight with my brother about watching TV. Uh, and so that's when I started reading comic books pretty actively. I would basically be, like every other day, I would be down at the 7-Eleven buying comic books. Um,
What was something you
and
kept you had to get every time you saw it?
Right, and from there, I just pretty much was a avid comic book reader. I discovered during my time, my one school year in Las Vegas, that comic book stores existed, and that was a thing.
Yeah.
After like buying my comics at the local convenience store. And then it became like, convincing my dad to take me to the comic book store once a month, to buy my comics and go
What
through the
comics
back
did
issue
you what comics
bins.
did you like look out for? What comics did you make sure you like, I gotta get this comic, I gotta get this comic?
hmm
Which ones?
So this was the really just like the beginning. It was basically 1980. So for me, it was New Teen Titans had just come out.
You're my new best friend,
That's
by the way. Now you mentioned that.
that series had
I'm a
just
big Nightwing
started,
fan. Yeah.
right? And so that was like Wolfman and Perez. That just blew me away. That was such a great book. And uh, I was very quickly the Legion of Superheroes, and I mean, pretty much I would read anything,
Yeah.
but I liked a lot. I was a DC kid at first. I read a lot of Marvel stuff, but I was definitely, the Superman and Batman and the Justice League were much more recognizable
Yeah.
characters to me.
Awesome. So when you were doing that, did you have a lot of influence with role playing as well at the same time?
Uh, so yeah, I started gaming when I was 12.
Okay.
Not long after that. this was two moves later. And when my family finally settled in New Hampshire, um, I discovered RPGs at a local bookstore, and I found the first edition of Gamma World, the old gray box set,
Okay.
which was brand new at the time. Dating myself,
Yeah.
and
I'm right
I
there with
just
you. Don't worry.
I begged for an advance on my allowance to buy it, basically. And I was just obsessed with the idea, because Gamma World for me played right into my fascination with superheroes and superpowers and all of that, because it had random mutation tables for rolling up your character's powers,
Yeah.
essentially, and their various mutant abilities. And so I just entertained myself for hours, just like rolling up random characters and reading the book and reading the adventures, and all of that. And I talked some friends of mine at school basically into playing it with me, and pretty much sealed my role as the group game master forever.
Yeah.
I was always the guy who was finding games and basically teaching my game group at the time to play them.
Yeah, I
You
was going to
know,
ask you, with moving around, did you have to like get a new game group every time you moved, or was that kind of at the tail end of your bouncing around?
well, it was pretty much that New Hampshire ended up being the end of that, because my parents finally decided that it would be a good idea for my brother and I to go to the same high school all 4 years in a row.
Yeah.
And that, because my brother is younger than me, guaranteed at least 6 years of not moving. And so I had a very active high school gaming group all through high school. Basically all the gaming nerds in high school, obviously hung together.
Yeah.
And we were playing, Gamma World and D&D and Marvel superheroes and most of TSR's catalog at the
Yeah.
time, as far as that went.
Being a person
Um,
myself that moved around a lot as well up until high school, I completely understand where you're coming from. That's why I asked, is like, how hard was that? Because I could just
yeah,
imagine, like, up new school, got to make new friends. Up new school, got to make new friends.
yeah, yeah. The funny thing is that actually, one member of my high school gaming group is still in my gaming group.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That is, yeah, that's, I think I have two or three that are still
Hmm.
like, I mean, we
Yeah.
moved, like, I moved, they move, and I'm like, I'm moving in the same area. Let's keep
Right.
gaming. Now in the digital world, that's not that big of a deal, right?
Yeah. Right.
How did you get, you were talking how you got into role playing and, comic books and stuff like that. How did you first get your foot in the door into, producing role playing or designing role playing?
So in the early 90s, I was online in the dial-up modem days. And I was active on the Genie network of all things. This is an early nascent computer network that was run by, of all things, General Electric. Um, and there were some gaming forums. I mean, of course, because it was an early computer network, it was all stuff catering to nerds. Um, and FASA Corporation, who published Shadowrun, had an active account on there, and they did their playtest of the second edition of Shadowrun, on the Shadowrun forum on that network. And so I got to participate in the playtest
Oh, wow.
for Shadowrun Second Edition, which was great because my group and I were obsessed with Shadowrun at the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
The first edition of Shadowrun came out, and I again, in my typical fashion, I bought it, came to my gaming group, and I'm like, we are playing this now, you know. Um, and so I got to participate in the playtest, and I gave a lot of, honestly, somewhat overeager feedback, and a lot of for lack of a better term, unsolicited feedback, that was like, oh, and you could do this, and how about this, and just like a bunch of ideas. Um, and Tom Dowd, who was the Shadowrun developer at the time, found my ideas more useful than annoying. And
It's a good trait to have.
right, I mean, I was grateful that it worked out that way. And he said, I'm going to include some of these things in the new draft if you're okay with that. And he had a freelancer drop out at the last minute for an essay in one of the second edition source books,
Okay.
and said, "Hey, would you be interested in writing it?" It's like 1,000 words, sort of a thing. And I was like,
Yeah.
"Yes, I absolutely want to do that." And then I was even more excited because I found out he would pay me. Um, um, and so I probably agonized more over that 1,000 words than any 1,000 words I've ever written. And it turned out that Tom liked that too. So he basically said, "Hey, are you interested in doing something else? We have an adventure collection coming up. Pitch me an idea for that." And that just started rolling into more assignments for Shadowrun. I got an adventure. I eventually pitched a source book that led to other projects,
Okay.
and eventually branching out to Earth Dawn, which was the Shadowrun's fantasy cousin
Yeah.
that was in development at FASA at the time. And
Is that also kind of where the books came into be that you worked on, the
uh,
novels?
yeah, and then eventually it led to the pitching for a novel project. Uh, and basically, when I got the contract for my first novel, and I had been freelancing for a while part time, and I had been branching out into freelancing for some other companies at
Okay.
that point. I did the thing they tell you not to do. I quit my day job, and I said I'm gonna devote more time to this writing thing.
Yeah.
Um, and um, uh, and basically I've been doing that ever since.
Nice. So you came out. You had seven books, right? In the
Uh,
Shadowrun, and then a couple other that weren't Shadowrun.
7 Shadowrun, 2 Crimson Skies, and Mech Warrior
Mech Warrior.
novel.
Yeah. How was the difference between moving? Because obviously, like coming up with ideas for a game, a role play
Mhm.
game, and game design, and then telling a story in a novel form. How difficult was that of a shift for you, and how did you deal with that shift?
Honestly, novel writing was a real challenge for me. And personally, I don't think I'm all that good at it. Um, um, I honestly enjoy the process of game writing more. Um, there's a joke that usually goes around that is along the lines of, I have this really cool new campaign, and I've come up with all of the characters and all of the adventures, and I know exactly how it ends, and I'm told that this is actually called writing a novel. uh, and um, I'm not like that as a game master. I actually, one of the things I like a lot about tabletop RPGs is how the story emerges from playing it,
Yeah.
and how a lot of unexpected elements come up, whether it's just different facets of the characters or different things the players choose to do, or even just random outcomes of the dice that just totally change things.
Yeah.
I really like that aspect of tabletop gaming as a game master and as a player. And so I tend to write towards that idea of, you're creating a framework where things can happen, but you're not necessarily dictating how they're going to happen.
Yeah.
And I found that really hard for me to narrow down to, okay, this is what happens
Yeah.
for a novel as far as that goes. I tend in my game writing to lean sometimes a little too heavily into options of, or you could do this, or you
Yeah.
could do this. When I was writing the second edition of Mutants and Masterminds, I did so many optional rules designs. I redesigned so many rule systems in different ways that by the time we cut all of that optional material out of the manuscript, basically we had a whole separate source book
Yeah.
of optional rules that we published as a separate book.
I think that's one of the big strengths of Mutants and Masterminds too, which we'll get into here down the road, is the options, the ability for flexibility. Like that's, I
Yeah,
think that's something that
yeah.
a lot of the audience and players love
Hmm.
about that system as well. Um, so do you still want to make more novels, or are you just done writing novels? Or is it like still maybe on the
Yeah,
table if somebody comes to you with an offer?
I'm I'm not ruling it out necessarily, but I really feel like I'd have to have a story that I really felt I needed to tell in order to want to write a novel. I don't think I would want to. I've had a couple of offers that have been along the lines of, "Hey, you're working on this thing. Would you also like to write a book, a novel, as part of this?" And I've
Yeah.
been like, No, not really." Like, I just don't feel like I've got that burning story to
Right.
tell, and I don't want to feel like I'm phoning it in as far as
Yeah.
that goes.
Yeah.
If I'm going to do a project, I really want to do it justice. So, if the right inspiration strikes, I'm not ruling out the possibility, but I just haven't really been leaning in that direction for quite
Yeah.
a while.
Yeah, it's fair enough. Makes sense. I had to ask though, because
Yeah,
there are
yeah,
people that are fans and they're gonna ask, so
yeah.
I might as well ask before they do. Let's shift gears a little bit. A little bit more recently, there's a really popular show called Critical Role, and they came out
Hmm.
with a Tal'Dorei campaign setting. And I know I talked to you a little bit beforehand, but I know our audience would skewer me if I didn't bring it up and ask you what your role was in that campaign setting, kind of what you did, how they approach you, or did somebody, how did that get facilitated?
So the Critical Role and Green Ronin Publishing, who is one of my basically Green Ronin is my sort of primary client for writing. I am on staff for Green Ronin to just write stuff basically.
Yeah.
Um, and Critical Role and Green Ronin worked out a licensing deal to do the Tal'Dorei book. I had very little to do with it. I'm credited in the book because I did some additional text here and there.
Okay.
The lion's share of Tal'Dorei goes to Joe Carricker, who was the primary developer
Okay.
and did a lot of the systems work, and James Hake, who also did a ton of the systems work, in addition to all of the setting material that Matt Mercer contributed. So they really made that book. My contributions were much more in the form of, advising Joe on a bunch of things and being like, hey, like let's look at this mechanic kind of thing, and doing a lot of flavor text
Yeah.
here and there. I did a bunch of the quotes in the book, amongst other things.
Did you have to sit down and watch the show a bunch to get some good quotes, or did you make up quotes, or
We did a little of
a
both,
little of both?
and it was becoming familiar with the setting, obviously,
Yeah.
but fortunately we had a source book,
Right.
so becoming familiar with the setting was not as hard.
Nice. So we're gonna say this is gonna be like a good, maybe a bad Quentin Tarantino film where we're gonna bounce around in the chronology
Hmm.
with that. So it's not necessarily in order going with that. So you talked about working at Green Ronin, and for those that are listening, it's
Hmm.
Green Ronin, not Ronin. I'm not going to get yelled at more than once.
That's
I didn't
that's
get yelled
that's
at.
how
Owen Casey Stevens corrected me on it
that's
at
how
one
that's how
point.
President Chris Pramas pronounces it. So that's how I
Yep,
pronounce it.
yep, and that's anybody that's worked there says that's how it's pronounced, so that's how I'm going to pronounce it.
Hmm.
So there we go, everyone. Um, so Mutants and Masterminds, how did this
Hmm.
come to be? Like for anybody that's listening,
Hmm.
best superhero RPG out there in history.
Thank you.
Um, how did this come to be? Did they approach you and be like, we're doing a superhero thing? You want to be part of it? Or did you go to them and be like, I want to do a superhero thing because Marvel superheroes is the only thing that's out there and it's not necessarily the best system in the world?
Interestingly enough, it was neither.
Okay.
The not so secret origin of Mutants and Masterminds was that when I was first freelancing for Green Ronin, they got their start as a D20 spin-off from with the open game license
Yeah.
and the like. One of the first two open game licensed projects, one of them was Death in Freeport, the adventure from Green Ronin, came out at the same Gen Con as the third edition Player's Handbook. Um, and Green Ronin got their start doing open game license products.
Mm-hmm.
I did a few freelance projects for them in those first year or two. Shaman's Handbook, Witch's Handbook, other basically D&D source books, essentially.
Okay.
And around that time, the very late 90s, early 2000s, I had been working on a superhero city setting book as a freelance project. And that project fell through. Basically, the original publisher decided they weren't going to publish it.
Okay.
Basically the rights reverted to me and I just held on to the manuscript, and it became sort of my fun side project to tinker with it.
Yeah.
And it sort of grew exponentially as I did that, and I just kind of messed around with different parts of it. I, of course, at this point had complete creative freedom because I wasn't, designing this for anyone
Yeah.
other than myself. So I just, like, okay, I'm going to fix all the things that I didn't like about this, and add some other things, and messed around with it for quite a while. And I was talking with Chris Pramus via email at one point, and I basically was just lamenting the fact that I had this superhero setting, that I thought was really cool. But at the time, there weren't any superhero games in print for me to pitch. There's literally nothing. Hero games, even Champions was basically out of print at that time.
Yeah.
And Silver Age Sentinels from Guardians of Order was just getting started, and I even approached them, and they were like, "Yeah, we've already got a setting planned, so we're really not interested in another one."
Yeah.
And so I was just basically complaining to Chris. I'm just like, hey, I have this, cool setting book, and I have nowhere I can even sell it. And he was like, well, can I take a look at it? And I said, sure. Sent him a copy of the manuscript. And he read it over, and he was like, yeah, this is good. I'll tell you what, if you're interested, we will talk about doing a 2-book deal where you will design a D20 superhero game using the open game license, and we'll publish the rule book for that game, and we'll publish your setting as the setting source book for it.
Yeah.
And I was like, does it have to be a D20 game? And Chris was like, yeah, I think that, he's like, that's our thing. We're really doing open game license stuff. It's that's really sort of the hot property. I think that we really have to go with that. I'm like, okay. So I thought about it for a while, and I really went through the system resource document for the D20 system, and I did a lot of taking things apart and looking at the math and being like, how am I going to make this work?
Yeah.
And I
Was
came
this like
up
your
with,
first big project?
depends on your definition of big.
Did you feel like it was a big project at the time?
It felt like it was a big project, yeah,
Okay.
to be sure. And basically, I came up with a pitch and sent it to Chris and it basically said, look, I've looked at all of this. I think I can make this work, but there's some things I want to change. I I don't think I can do this well as a compatible with Dungeons and Dragons
Yeah.
product.
Yeah.
I think I can use the core system for it, but there are things I want to change to make it more superhero-y,
Yeah. Sure.
and all of that. And so I'm like, so if we do this, we can't use the D20 license. We can use the open game license, but the D20 logo, which was a compatibility logo at the time,
Yeah.
required compatibility with D&D.
Yeah.
It basically says this product usable with Dungeons and Dragons. And I was like, I'm like, I don't think that's going to work, and Chris read my pitch. We discussed it. He ultimately agreed with me and was willing to take, at the time, what I thought was a reasonable risk,
Yeah.
because nobody had really done much with just the open game license and foregone the compatibility logo.
Right.
And so we went ahead with it. The first edition of Mutants and Masterminds did really well. Green Ronin brought me on board the following year to develop it fully as a game line. And I was developer for the game for several years, until I decided that I didn't like doing development
Yeah.
as much as I liked actually writing things. Um,
Was there and you're talking about development a little bit, was there a challenge in, I mean, you're playing superheroes where the
mhm,
sky is the limit,
Yep.
but you still have to, like, if you're at this power level, you have to face stuff at this power level, and keeping that balance, was that a huge challenge?
Well, that was the idea behind the power level mechanic in Mutants and Masterminds, which was the kind of the game's nod to the leveling mechanic in D&D,
Mm-hmm.
where we sort of took the reverse approach, and instead of it being about starting at really low level and working your way up this sort of power curve, it was about setting that level as sort of the expectation for the game. What was the overall power level that things were operating at, and then using that to basically provide limits on what the characters could do,
Yeah.
so that you would have a sense of the ballpark they should fall into, in terms of their overall abilities.
Was that hard going from, like, this guy is immortal to this guy is polka dot man, and trying to figure out how those
Mhm.
levels and how those levels worked?
Yeah, sometimes, and sometimes it was a matter of uh, you know taking a certain amount of dramatic license,
Mm-hmm.
as far as that went. But I think that in my opinion, I think that the hero point mechanics in Mutants and Masterminds are intended to make up for a lot of that.
Yeah.
And they provide everybody with a lot of flexibility for what I tend to refer to as lateral wins in a game situation or in a dramatic situation.
Yeah.
A lot of stories in comics are about basically a problem that the heroes can't solve easily, in one way or the other. It's either a guy who is invulnerable to their powers, or omnipotent, or has some sort of advantage they can't easily counter.
Right.
And it's about them coming up with a novel solution to the problem. I mean, there are plenty of comic book scenarios that are just solved by punching them really hard.
Yeah.
Uh, but the real core stories of the genre are really about those lateral wins, about like how do you like defeat this guy who you can't hurt,
Yeah.
in one way or another. And so the hero point mechanics are definitely intended to provide some of that improvisation, that the players can use to their advantage.
And it really does give it a superhero feel, and just
Mhm.
some of the stuff where it's like, where it gives the option for storytelling. You spend a hero point to add something to the scene for storyline.
Mhm.
Instead of saying what's around the area, can I use it, you can use your points to set that scene, or the GM
Right.
can be like, yeah, this doesn't go along with my alternate story. Here's a point for that, and we're just going to move along. Like, I love that feel where it really gives it that comic book feel, or something can tragically go wrong if that's what the GM kind of wants to tell you, but you get rewarded for it, so you don't feel like the
Hmm.
GM's just hosing you over. There's just so
Right.
many great mechanics in the system that you don't see in any other system, and it's perfect for a superhero system. You mentioned earlier talking about like playing the Teen Titans or reading the Teen
Hmm.
Titans comics and DC and some of that other stuff. You guys then developed the DC Adventures, which is
Hmm.
making kind of using the Mutants Masterminds kind of system, but for DC. Did
Yeah.
DC come to you, or did you guys go to DC? Do
Yeah.
you know how that kind of came about?
We had we had talked to DC for years before DC Adventures. A lot of back and forth in terms of, hey, we're interested, who do we talk to, et cetera, et cetera. Um, it's really challenging working with a major or a major media conglomerate and or a major subdivision of one,
Yeah,
like Warner Brothers in DC, because staff turnover, and you're talking to one person in the marketing department and then they're promoted or they leave, and you're talking to their replacement and their replacement is like, who are you and what do you do and why am I talking to you?
right.
And um, the the unvarnished truth of it is that from the perspective of media companies like DC, role-playing games are not great licensing, um, because they involve a lot of approvals and a lot of resources, and they make comparatively very little money.
Yeah,
So, I mean, from DC's perspective, it's a lot easier to approve a Superman T-shirt or a Superman lunchbox or whatever,
yeah,
where someone in marketing just has to go, "Yes, that art is correct and looks like Superman. You are approved." Versus, "Hey, DC, will you read this 260-page book and tell us if there are any mistakes in it?
right, right.
Oh, and also check all the artwork."
Yeah,
you know,
make sure that their powers are accurate.
right? You know, and so you can understand how DC would be like, maybe not.
Yeah,
Um, the thing, honestly, that worked in our favor was DC's 75th anniversary was coming up at the time, and DC's marketing department basically wanted just a massive blitz of DC product out there. They wanted DC everywhere
yeah,
on everything. And so that included in gamer space. They wanted an RPG, and we had been talking to them, and they were like, "Hey, there are these people who keep bothering us about an RPG. Let's talk to them." And so we were able to make real headway on a deal, and we're able to basically cut a 4-book deal with DC, which is what we did. That we would publish a core rule book. We would do 2 character books, the heroes and villains guides, that would just cover as many DC characters as we could cram into them.
yeah.
Um,
Which is
and we would
awesome, by the
do
way.
and we would do a DC universe setting book, which would double for our purposes as a 3rd character book, where we would offload a bunch of minor characters that we couldn't cram into
Yeah,
the
or,
2
or
character
alternate
books.
universe
Right,
characters,
and
which I thought,
alternate versions,
which
and
honestly I thought that was a genius idea, because there are
mhm.
comic books, as you know, they change. Like, oh, we're rebooting to
Yep.
the new 52, and everything changes. The
Well,
outfits change, all of that kind of stuff. And you're like, okay, well,
uh,
let's throw out the version of Robin and the version of Red Robin and the version of Nightwing as Robin.
that was the funny part, is we talked about, given DC's lengthy history, about what version of any given character we were going to do. And we decided we were going to try and aim for the most essential version of the character we could, in terms of boiling it down to like the unchanging elements of that character. As far as it goes, one of the big challenges working with the freelancers who were helping write a lot of characters for the heroes and villains books was we had a lot of very engaged and very passionate fans who obviously loved these characters and loved
Yeah.
this universe. And what we had to constantly tell them was write less. Like nobody, you can't talk this much about the character's history. You know, we have given you 500 words. You have written 2,000 words about this character's history. Like, you know, boil it down, even more essential than that. You
Yeah.
know, like but the best part about all of that process was we were halfway through the process of producing the Heroes and Villains books when DC told us that they were going to do New 52. And they were like, oh, by the way, we're rebooting our entire universe and all of our comic book lines, and they're going to be completely different. And we were like, okay. And can you tell us what they're going to be like? And they were like, no, we can't give you any information about the new books at all. That information is very restricted.
Wow.
And we're like, okay. So we're going to stick to what we're doing with the really essential versions of the characters
Right.
and hope that goes well. And so our DC Adventures game ended up essentially being the last licensed version / summary of the pre-New 52 DC universe.
Yeah. Which up to that point was the last version till the new. Yeah.
Yeah.
They weren't going back as far as we all knew. You know,
Right. Yeah.
hindsight being what it is.
It's comics.
It worked out
so,
great. They put everything back to normal just for you guys. Just
Yeah.
that's what you
Yeah.
said. uh, so much like DC Comics,
Mhm.
you guys have signed a new comic book company, right?
Yes.
Valiant Comics.
Yeah. Yeah. We have a signed deal with Valiant Comics. We're producing a Valiant Adventures RPG that is powered by Mutants and Masterminds. And the plan is that we're doing a Valiant Adventures Heroes Handbook
Okay.
that will be the rule book and a Worlds of Valiant source book, as well as some character write-ups and the like, much like we did with DC in that similar vein.
And is it just going to be, how many books is it going to be? Just the one?
Right now it is like right now they're the two books that I can talk about,
Okay.
which is the Heroes Handbook and the Worlds of Valiant stuff.
Okay.
But basically rule book and setting book, which is kind of Mutants and Masterminds history.
Now, I've got to ask this because I know I'll be slapped by the audience or viewers or anybody listening to this. Will it be cross compatible? Like, will you be able to have a crossover? Because a lot of people love comic book crossovers.
Mm-hmm.
Can you have a DC Valiant crossover and a DC Mutants and Masterminds Freedom City crossover?
I mean, sure, theoretically. You know, we're definitely not going to be, we're not going to be like referencing DC Adventures
Right.
as a benchmark.
But as a system.
But system-wise, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's still going to be the Mutants and Mastermind system. So
Yeah.
if you want to use the character stats from any of those games together, you certainly could.
Which, who doesn't love doing stuff like that? Like that, I think
Right?
that's a huge selling point
Absolutely.
for any RPG to be able to do crossovers. A lot of people that do role playing, they're like, well, we've got this Eberron D&D campaign, and we've got this,
Mhm.
Dragonlance setting. What happens if those characters met? That would be really cool. And people love doing games like that. And I think
Yeah.
Mutants and Masterminds is a great system to be able to do that with, especially when before, when people are playing Mutants and Masterminds, then you release the DC and they're like, it's the same system. We can have Superman show up and we have his actual stats. Great.
Yeah.
So I had to ask.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you know and I have a rough idea of when that's going to be coming out?
Next year.
Next year? Okay.
Yep.
Beginning, late, or not quite sure?
Probably, I'm guessing probably mid next year.
Mid next year? Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
It's
I mean, we're not going to quote you on it, but just so
Yeah.
People have an idea of when to start.
Yeah.
Looking a little bit more deeply at it and
Yeah.
checking out all of that thing. So People can also find you have a Patreon. Mutants and
Hmm.
Masterminds has a Patreon. Let's talk about the Mutants and Masterminds Patreon.
Sure.
What can they
The,
get on that? What happens there?
mhm. We started the Mutants and Masterminds Patreon during the pandemic, um, because when a lot of things started closing down, the key thing for us as publishers was that, in addition to all of the shipping issues, printers were closing down, and basically, like their our production schedules were just train wrecked. It was basically like, we can't print any books, and we don't know when we're going to be able to print any books. And once we are able to print books, we don't know how backed up the printers' schedules are going to be.
Yeah,
Um, so we basically were like, okay, we need to pivot towards more online and electronic content. We need to do more virtual tabletop. We need to do more, PDF product, that kind of a thing. And one of the things we came up with was saying, hey, we will basically create a Patreon for the core Mutants and Masterminds fans to subscribe, and we will produce more online content through that, that will provide us with an additional venue for product. Um, and we started off with converting older Mutants and Masterminds character stats to the current third edition, to provide a stream of content for folks in terms of just regular character stats
yeah,
they could use. But we've since added developing unique products through the Patreon. We did our Starhaven sourcebook for Mutants and Masterminds that details the alien enclave on the Jupiter's moon Europa in the Earth Prime setting, based on feedback and interest from the patrons, who were like, "Hey, how about this? Like throwaway reference that
yeah.
was in Cosmic Handbook. What? Tell us about that place." And we're like, "Okay," and like we did a whole source book on it with input and feedback from the patrons, who got to do things like vote on what Starhaven's form of government looks like, and had input into some of the major characters and things like that. Um, we've done live stream adventures for the patrons, including play tests of some of our Astonishing Adventures products before they were released, or adventures that were written for the live stream have come Astonishing Adventures products. I did an adventure called Menace on Mystery Mountain for the patrons on one of our live streams, and then wrote it up as an Astonishing Adventures product. Um, and develop monthly developer Q&As, and opportunities to just get previews of upcoming M&M projects and things like that. And we're in the process of adding more things to the Patreon all the time, really, as far as it goes. It's really sort of our core M&M audience fan group when it comes to getting a sense of what people are most interested in for the game, because we
Yeah.
know people have really bought into it, literally.
What about your Patreon? What do you do over there?
So my Patreon, which is patreon.com/Steve Kenson, is an opportunity for me to basically indulge in my hobby superhero game, which is called Icon's Superpowered Role Playing. My colleagues at Green Ronin like to joke that I have a problem, and that I can't stop designing superhero games, and I hold out that I can quit anytime I want to. Um, but I ended up uh, tinkering with this idea for a superhero game some years after Mutants and Masterminds. that did a number of things that Mutants and Masterminds at the time didn't particularly do. Um, and it basically grew out of my interest in Stephen O'Sullivan's design for Fudge, the RPG engine.
I haven't heard
Um,
that game in forever.
I love Stephen's design for Fudge. I think it has a lot of really interesting ideas to it. Um, and playing around with the idea that both Fudge and Marvel superheroes used um, descriptive adjectives for their traits rather than necessarily numerical values. There were numerical values as well, but
Right.
the adjectives were the key thing about the traits
Yeah.
that I really liked. And I really felt that added a very accessible element to the system,
Okay.
because it was much more interesting to say that a character had average or incredible intelligence to somebody, as opposed to saying, oh, well, this guy's intelligence is a 3 and this guy's intelligence is a 7.
Yeah.
I mean, to the average person, that first thing actually means something. And the other thing is like, well, I don't know what those numbers mean.
Right.
And so I was playing around with the notion that of that idea, as well as the idea of random character generation with superheroes. Because, like I mentioned, I got my start in RPGs playing them with Gamma World and its mutation tables and all of that. My first superhero game was Villains and Vigilantes, which was also a random character generation system, where you were supposed to play yourself with randomly generated superpowers.
I love playing myself in RPGs, gotta say.
Right?
Who doesn't?
And for me as a 13-year-old gamer, that was aces. I was down with that. And so I ended up playing around with the system, and I came up with the core system of what would become icons. And I published a first edition of it with Adamant Entertainment. And because, as it happened at the time, Gareth Skarka, who ran in Adamant, happened to express basically that he was looking for or looking to produce a superhero game. And he basically described what I designed. And I was like, hey, it's funny you should mention that because I just designed a game like that. Eventually, I parted ways with Adamant because they were just overwhelmed with production issues.
Yeah.
And I had a clause in my contract to take back the rights to the game. And I did some supplementary material I did a new edition of it, and I did some supplementary material for it. And basically, I set up the Patreon so that I can justify continuing to write things for it, because somebody is actually paying me to do it.
Yeah. Instead of just doing it. I mean, you were going to do it for free anyhow. You might as well.
Chances are I was probably going to do it for free anyway. But honestly, knowing that someone is paying for it and having a deadline is really great at keeping me honest.
Yeah.
I would probably have written a lot less if that hadn't been the case.
Yeah. It's always nice to get paid for something you're passionate about too, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's shift gears one last little time here. There's a YouTube show that you're part of, yes?
That would be
YouTube / at Green Ronin.
That would be Mutants and Masterminds Mondays.
Tell us about that.
Which I just did a couple of hours ago.
Yeah, how was that?
Mutants and Masterminds Monday is another creation of the pandemic, where, amongst other things, we decided as we pivoted to other forms of content, we also needed to reach out to our audience in other ways. Since we weren't going to be putting products on the game store shelf in front of them for the foreseeable future at that time, we needed to keep in touch with our fan base, with our players. And so we started up 2 streaming shows. One was Mutants and Masterminds Monday. The other is called Thursday Age, which focuses on the age system.
Which we didn't even talk about tonight. We haven't even talked about it. We'll have to have you back down the road for that. Yeah, continue on about YouTube, the YouTube show.
And so initially, Mutants and Masterminds Monday was the brainchild of Troy Hewitt, our media manager, and Troy, God's bless him, is the kind of guy who can take a bunch of game designers who will just talk a problem over endlessly. And Troy will be just like, okay, we're doing this. This is the time. We're going to go live on, YouTube, and we're just going to, you're going to talk about the game. And that's it. And we'll figure out the rest as we go. And that's pretty much what we did. Was we just initially started, we just went live, we would just talk, fans would come in and ask questions, things like that. And as we went, we would, eventually do things like plan what we were going to talk about in advance.
Yeah.
Work
in progress.
Right. It was very much a work in progress, but it was definitely something that provided a place for people to come together, to see and talk to us, to share their ideas about the game and what they were enjoying. And it has definitely taken on a life of its own. We've been doing M&M Mondays for over 2 years now.
Wow.
And pretty much with the exception of, major holidays and the like, it's every Monday.
Awesome. Are you the GM for that?
So, well, the M&M Mondays itself is not a live stream game, but just a 1 hour,
I thought maybe
show.
It eventually shifted into a game.
Well, there definitely have been, and there are live stream games. We do. Green Ronin does primarily live stream games through the Patreon, where patrons have a chance to play in some of the live stream games. And we are fortunate enough to have a very active M&M fan base that also runs a lot of live stream game content, particularly over on Untold Stories Project, where folks are doing a number of different M&M live stream games. And M&M developer Alex Thomas is running a game tonight, as a matter of fact, as part of his Freedom League Dark series.
Well, maybe if they are on when we are done, we will give them a raid and see how that works out. So, for those that are in the live stream, stick around. We're going to do a live stream Q&A here in a little bit, so stick around for that. And for those that are listening to the podcast, we got some more information for you. But again, the M&M Patreon is patreon.com/mutants and masterminds. Again, Steve's Patreon is patreon.com/Steve Kenson. And you can find you on Twitter at S Kenson, and Instagram at Steve Kenson. So S Kenson on Twitter and Steve Kenson on Instagram. If those are all correct, I got them.
Yep,
got them right?
Absolutely.
Yes, and you can find him at stevekenson.com. Really easy to find. Not Kinson, guys.
Nope.
Kenson. Don't get them flip-flopped. Also, everyone, I want to let you know about some of our upcoming guests. We're on a RPG little string here. June 5th, a new RPG company is forging its path. Elena Marinich will be joining us to talk about Ubi's adventures, as well as their current Kickstarter that just started, Sentima Sundered Wilds. You play in an insect universe, and you're fighting other insects, and it's a big in-depth thing. Their stuff looks great, their art looks great, the game system looks a lot of fun. So that's going to be a fun episode. The podcast will be available on June 6th. June 17th, another person who's worked on Critical Role's Territory is its cartographer. He's known for his Warhammer and other RPG systems as well. He's also the co-owner of Rookery Publications. Andy Law is going to be joining us on June 17th. That episode is going to be available on the podcast June 18th. So please make sure to join us for those episodes. Also, we have our Game Masters workshop that's going to be coming up here this weekend on Saturday, just on Twitch, guys. So if you want to catch it, we're going to be joined by the crew over at Everyday Heroes. Siegfried Trent's putting together a group of people to talk about role playing, answer your questions, help you learn to be a better game master or a better player. This is our once-a-month show, so make sure to join us for the Game Masters workshop on Saturday. It's going to be an amazing, amazing program and an amazing show and a lot of fun. And of course, we're going to talk about their Kickstarter as well. So make sure to join us for that. For those listening, make sure to rate, review, click follow, subscribe, click all of the buttons. It helps us and it helps our guests. So for Steve Kenson, I am Nick, and I want to say thank you for listening to Epic Realms.